Diana clutched her son's small hand as they waited in line at the movie theater, her heart sinking as she counted the remaining bills in her wallet. After a grueling month of double shifts at the diner and cutting corners wherever possible, she had just enough for 2 tickets to the superhero movie Tommy had been talking about for weeks. His eyes had lit up when she surprised him this morning, and that moment alone had been worth all the extra hours on her feet. "Can we get popcorn too, Mom?" Tommy looked up at her with those hopeful brown eyes that reminded her so much of his father, who had walked out 3 years ago, leaving them with nothing but a mountain of debt and broken promises. "We'll see, buddy," Diana replied, the familiar knot tightening in her stomach. She already knew the answer was no. After paying for the tickets, there wouldn't be enough for even the smallest size of popcorn, let alone drinks. But she couldn't bear to see his excitement dim just yet. As they approached the counter, Diana's hands trembled slightly. "2 tickets for Cosmic Heroes, please," she said, sliding over the carefully counted bills. Tommy bounced on his heels, his gaze fixed on the illuminated menu board displaying all the snacks they couldn't afford. Diana received their tickets and change, a measly $3.75, not even half the cost of the smallest popcorn. "Let's go find our seats," Diana suggested quickly, trying to steer Tommy away from the concession stand. "But Mom, you said we'd see about popcorn," Tommy whispered, his voice small but not accusatory. It was worse than if he'd thrown a tantrum. His quiet understanding of their situation made her heart break. "I know, honey, but," Diana started, her voice catching. How could she explain that she had to choose between electricity next week or popcorn today? "Is everything okay?" A gentle, somewhat familiar voice came from behind them. Diana turned to find herself looking into kind eyes that she could swear she'd seen before. The man standing there wore a simple black cap and casual clothes, but there was something unmistakable about him. "We're fine, thank you," Diana answered automatically, the pride she clung to making her straighten her shoulders despite the embarrassment coloring her cheeks. The man glanced down at Tommy, who was now studying his sneakers, then back to Diana. "I couldn't help but overhear. Would you mind if I bought you both some popcorn? I always get too much for myself anyway." Before Diana could formulate a polite refusal, Tommy looked up and his eyes widened in recognition. "Mom." "That's Shu," the man smiled, putting a finger to his lips. "Just a fellow movie fan." Diana finally placed him. The internet was always full of stories about him. It was Keanu Reeves. Not making a scene, not with an entourage, just standing there offering to buy her son popcorn as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "I couldn't possibly," Diana began, but Keanu was already turning toward the counter. "1 large popcorn and 2 drinks, please," he said to the wide-eyed teenager behind the register, who clearly recognized him as well. Tommy tugged at Diana's sleeve, whispering urgently, "Mom, that's the guy from those movies Dad used to watch." Diana found herself speechless as Keanu returned with a large tub of buttery popcorn and 2 sodas, handing them to Tommy, whose face had transformed with pure joy. "Thank you," Diana finally managed, her voice barely audible over the ambient noise of the theater. Keanu smiled, that same gentle smile that millions had seen on screen. "Enjoy the movie," he said simply. Then, leaning down slightly to Tommy's level, he added, "Heroes aren't just in movies, you know. Sometimes they're standing right beside you every day." He glanced meaningfully at Diana. As he turned to leave, he pressed something into Diana's hand. When she looked down, she saw it wasn't just a $20 bill folded around a business card, it was the beginning of a moment that would change everything. Diana sat beside Tommy in the darkened theater, barely watching the superheroes dash across the screen. Her son munched happily on the popcorn, occasionally offering her the tub with buttery fingers, oblivious to the storm of emotion swirling inside her. The business card Keanu had slipped her was tucked safely in her purse, but she couldn't stop thinking about it, or the $20 bill folded around it. Life hadn't always been this difficult. 4 years ago, Diana had been a dental assistant with a steady income, a husband who worked in construction, and a cute rental house in a decent neighborhood. They weren't rich, but they were comfortable. Tommy had new clothes for school and weekend trips to the zoo. There was always enough for popcorn at the movies. Everything changed when Jeff lost his job and started drinking. The arguments grew more frequent, the bills piled higher, and one morning, Diana woke to find him gone, along with their savings and her grandmother's jewelry. The divorce papers arrived 3 weeks later, along with the first of many missed child support payments. Diana had been forced to leave her job when the dental office downsized. The only work she could find was waiting tables at Hank's Diner on the edge of town, where the tips were unpredictable and the hours brutal. She'd taken on a second job cleaning offices at night, but even with both incomes, there was never quite enough. They'd moved 3 times in the past 2 years, each apartment smaller than the last. Their current home was a 1-bedroom above a noisy convenience store. Diana slept on the pull-out couch, giving Tommy the bedroom. The place smelled perpetually of fryer grease from the shop below, but it was what they could afford. Through it all, Diana had tried to shield Tommy from the worst of their struggles. She skipped meals so he could eat. She mended his clothes by hand and told him it was to be eco-friendly. She worked holidays and sent him to stay with her sister so he wouldn't know she couldn't afford gifts. This movie was the first treat they'd had in months. Diana had been saving loose change for weeks, hiding it in an old coffee can labeled Tommy's Movie Day. When she finally had enough for 2 tickets, she'd planned the entire day around it, a rare Saturday when she wasn't scheduled at either job. "Mom, this is the best day ever," Tommy whispered, his eyes never leaving the screen. "The popcorn makes it perfect." Diana swallowed the lump in her throat. It should have been such a simple thing, buying her son popcorn at the movies. Something most parents wouldn't think twice about. Yet it had been impossible for her, until a celebrity's random act of kindness. The shame of it burned. Diana had always prided herself on independence, on making things work no matter what. Having to accept help from a stranger, even a famous, wealthy one, felt like admitting failure. But the look on Tommy's face when he'd received that popcorn was worth every ounce of pride she had to swallow. When the movie ended and the lights came up, Tommy was buzzing with excitement. "That was awesome. Did you see when the blue superhero flew through the building? And when they all teamed up at the end?" "I saw it, buddy," Diana smiled, gathering their things. She'd barely registered any of the plot, her mind too full of calculations, rent due next week, Tommy's sneakers falling apart, the persistent cough he'd had that probably needed a doctor's visit they couldn't afford. As they walked out of the theater, Tommy spotted a movie poster. "Can we come back when the sequel comes out?" "We'll see," Diana said automatically, the same non-committal response she gave to most of his requests. Outside in the parking lot, Diana pulled the business card from her purse while Tommy skipped ahead. It wasn't Keanu's personal contact information, as she'd first thought. Instead, it was for a community foundation that offered emergency assistance to families in need. On the back, written in neat handwriting, "They helped me once. No judgment, just support. Kr." Diana's fingers trembled as she held the card. Her pride screamed at her to throw it away, to keep struggling alone as she always had. But a quieter voice, one that sounded suspiciously like her mother's, whispered that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is accept help when it's offered. Tommy ran back to her, his face still bright with the joy of their unexpected encounter. "Mom, do you think we'll ever see him again?" Diana tucked the card carefully back into her wallet. "I don't know, honey. But I think he's already done more for us than he realizes." As they walked to the bus stop, Diana felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. A tiny spark of hope, fragile but persistent, like a single star appearing in a clouded night sky. Keanu slipped into the back row of the theater, baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He wasn't trying to avoid fans, he genuinely appreciated their support, but today he wanted to enjoy the movie without interruption. His gaze drifted to the front where he could see Tommy's silhouette, the boy's excitement visible even from a distance as he gestured animatedly to his mother during a particularly thrilling scene. The encounter with Diana and her son had affected him more than he expected. Perhaps it was the determined dignity in her eyes, or the way the boy had tried to hide his disappointment about something as simple as popcorn. It reminded Keanu of his own childhood struggles, memories that Hollywood's success hadn't erased. Few people knew about Keanu's early years, the multiple moves, his father's absence, and his mother's tireless work to support the family. Despite his fame and fortune, he'd never forgotten what it felt like to want things that seemed forever out of reach. This connection to his past was why he'd established the private foundation that had helped countless families like Diana's, all without publicity or recognition. As the movie neared its end, Keanu slipped out before the credits. In the lobby, he approached the theater manager, a man named Robert who had worked there for over 20 years. "That woman and her son in Theater 3, the one with the red sweater," Keanu said quietly. "Could you do me a favor?" Robert nodded, having long ago become accustomed to Keanu's random acts of kindness whenever he visited this particular theater. It was one of the actor's habits during filming in the area, stopping by unannounced, paying for strangers' tickets, and disappearing before anyone could make a fuss. "Give her this," Keanu handed Robert an envelope. "But wait until next week, and don't tell her it's from me." Inside was a gift card for a year of free movies and concessions, along with a note about a random drawing their tickets had won. It wasn't the first time Keanu had arranged such a gift, and it wouldn't be the last. Walking to his motorcycle parked discreetly behind the theater, Keanu thought about his own struggles with grief and loss over the years. The personal tragedies that had shaped him weren't something he discussed publicly, but they had instilled in him a deep empathy for others facing difficult times. He hoped Diana would contact the foundation. They did good work without fanfare, helping with rent, utilities, job placement, and childcare. All the practical things that could lift a family from crisis to stability. The kind of help that preserved dignity while providing real solutions. Keanu had learned long ago that fame granted him not just wealth, but influence. After years in the spotlight, he'd discovered that his greatest joy came not from accolades or attention, but from these quiet moments of connection, the opportunities to ease someone else's burden, however briefly. As he started his motorcycle, Keanu smiled, thinking of Tommy's face lighting up at the popcorn. Sometimes the smallest gestures created the most significant impact. The boy probably wouldn't remember the movie's plot in a few years, but he might remember the day a stranger showed kindness to his mother. Keanu didn't know if he'd ever cross paths with Diana and Tommy again, but he had a feeling their story wasn't finished. The foundation would reach out if Diana called, offering whatever assistance she was comfortable accepting. The rest would be up to her. As he pulled away from the theater, Keanu felt the familiar sense of peace that came from these small, anonymous acts. In a world that constantly demanded his public persona, these private moments of genuine connection were what kept him grounded, reminders of what truly mattered beyond the cameras and fame. Diana sat at her kitchen table late that night, staring at the business card Keanu had given her. Tommy was fast asleep, still wearing the superhero t-shirt he'd insisted on keeping on. The day's excitement had thoroughly worn him out, but not before he'd recounted every detail of meeting the real-life John Wick to Diana's sister over the phone. With trembling fingers, Diana dialed the number on the card. She'd almost talked herself out of it a dozen times, but Tommy's persistent cough from the other room finally convinced her. Pride wouldn't pay for medicine or doctor's visits. Community Bridges Foundation, this is Elena. How can I help you? The voice that answered was warm and professional. I was given this number by. Diana hesitated, unsure how to explain. Did someone refer you to us? Elena prompted gently. Yes. The card has the initials KR on it. There was a brief pause. I see. We have a special intake process for referrals from that particular donor. Would tomorrow morning work for a meeting? Diana arranged to visit their office during Tommy's school hours. She hung up feeling equal parts nervous and relieved. The next morning, after dropping Tommy at school, Diana found herself in a modest office building downtown. Elena turned out to be a kind-faced woman in her 50s who listened without judgment as Diana reluctantly shared their situation. Our foundation can help with immediate needs and long-term stability, Elena explained. We have funds specifically allocated for families in your situation. She never mentioned Keanu by name, maintaining the discretion he clearly valued. By the end of the meeting, Diana had walked away with appointments for Tommy at a pediatric clinic, emergency assistance for their utility bills, and information about a dental office looking for experienced assistants, paying significantly more than her current jobs combined. A week later, Diana returned from work to find an envelope waiting at their apartment. Inside was a movie theater gift card for a year of movies and concessions, along with a note claiming they'd won a random drawing. Tommy had whooped with joy, but Diana suspected it wasn't random at all. The following month brought unexpected changes. The dental office hired Diana, allowing her to quit both her previous jobs while still increasing her income. Tommy's persistent cough was diagnosed as mild asthma, and with proper medication, he began sleeping through the night for the first time in months. They moved to a better apartment, one with 2 bedrooms and windows that let in actual sunlight. Tommy started bringing friends home from school, no longer embarrassed by where they lived. One Saturday, visiting the movie theater with their gift card, the manager Robert stopped to chat with them. "You know," he said casually, "he comes in here every few months when he's filming nearby. Never wants any attention." "Who does?" Tommy asked. Robert just smiled. "Enjoys seeing people happy, that's all. Says the movies are where people can forget their problems for a while." Diana understood then that what Keanu had given them wasn't just popcorn or even financial assistance, it was dignity. He'd helped without making them feel like charity cases. He'd given without expecting gratitude or recognition. That evening, Diana sat Tommy down for a talk. "Remember when we met Keanu Reeves, and he bought us popcorn?" Tommy nodded enthusiastically. "That was the best day ever." "Well, I think he may have helped us in other ways too," Diana explained carefully. "And I've been thinking about how we might pay that kindness forward." They decided to start small. Once a month, they would go to the theater and anonymously pay for another family's tickets and concessions. When the cashier would point to Diana and Tommy, they'd simply say, "Someone did this for us once. We're just passing it along." Diana knew their small gesture couldn't compare to what Keanu had done for them, but it felt important to continue the chain of kindness. It was teaching Tommy something more valuable than any movie plot, that compassion could change lives, often in ways the giver might never fully realize. As winter turned to spring, Diana found herself looking at strangers differently, wondering about their hidden struggles, considering how a small act of kindness might impact their day. She'd begun volunteering at the community foundation that had helped them, giving a few hours each weekend to help other families navigate the resources available. Tommy kept the popcorn bucket from that fateful day on a shelf in his room. "It's my reminder," he told Diana seriously, "that heroes are real." 2 years had passed since that chance encounter at the movie theater. Diana stood at the back of an elementary school auditorium, watching with misty eyes as Tommy delivered his speech for the 5th grade graduation ceremony. "My hero isn't someone with superpowers or a cape," Tommy began, his voice steady, despite the crowd. "My hero is someone who taught me that kindness can change lives. A few years ago, when my mom and I were having a really tough time, a stranger helped us in a way that changed everything." Diana's heart swelled with pride. Tommy hadn't told her what his speech would be about, wanting it to be a surprise. Now she understood why. In the 2 years since meeting Keanu Reeves, their lives had transformed in ways Diana could never have imagined. Her position at the dental office had led to a promotion to office manager. They'd moved again, this time to a small but charming house with a yard where Tommy could play. For the first time since Jeff left, Diana had savings in the bank and didn't flinch when the mail arrived. But the most significant changes weren't financial. Diana had discovered a strength within herself she hadn't known existed, the courage to accept help when needed and then extend that same hand to others. Their monthly tradition of paying for another family's movie experience had expanded. Now they volunteered regularly at the local food bank and organized an annual backpack drive for school supplies through Diana's office. Tommy's grades had improved dramatically once his asthma was properly treated. His teacher had recommended him for a gifted program, and he'd developed a passion for writing stories, always featuring unlikely heroes performing quiet acts of kindness. So my message today, Tommy continued in his speech, is that you never know how one small act of kindness might change someone's whole life. And you never know when the person standing next to you might be a hero, not because they're famous or rich, but because they choose to be kind. Diana wiped away a tear as the audience applauded. She hadn't seen Keanu Reeves since that day at the theater, though she occasionally spotted news articles about his philanthropic work, always done quietly, without fanfare. She'd written him a letter of gratitude through the foundation but never knew if he'd received it. After the ceremony, as families mingled in the schoolyard enjoying cake and punch, Robert from the movie theater approached Diana with his teenage daughter. "Thought you might want to know," he said quietly. "He was in town filming last month. Asked how you two were doing." Diana's breath caught. "What did you tell him?" "Just that you were doing well. That Tommy was thriving." Robert smiled. He seemed pleased. Later that evening, as Diana tucked Tommy into bed, her son asked a question that had been on his mind. "Mom, do you think we'll ever see him again?" "Keanu, I mean." Diana smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "I don't know, honey. But I think what matters isn't whether we see him again, but what we do with the gift he gave us." "You mean the popcorn?" Tommy grinned. "I mean the lesson," Diana laughed softly. "About how powerful kindness can be. How it can start a chain reaction that keeps going." The next weekend, they went to see the newest superhero movie, using the last of their year-long pass. As they stood in line for popcorn, Diana noticed a woman ahead of them counting change from her purse, a young girl beside her looking longingly at the concession stand menu. Diana and Tommy exchanged a glance, no words needed. They stepped forward together. "Excuse me," Diana said to the woman. "My son and I have a tradition. We'd love to treat you and your daughter to popcorn and drinks today." The woman's expression shifted from surprise to hesitation to grateful acceptance, a journey Diana recognized intimately. "Thank you," she said softly. "You have no idea what this means." "Actually," Diana replied with a warm smile, "I think we do." As they sat in the theater watching previews, Tommy leaned over to whisper, "Do you think she might be like us? From before?" Diana nodded. "Maybe. But what matters is what happens after." This was the true gift Keanu Reeves had given them, not just momentary help or financial stability, but a profound understanding of how a single act of compassion could ripple outward in countless directions, touching lives in ways the giver might never witness. As the movie started, Diana made a silent promise to continue their chain of kindness, knowing that somewhere out there, a humble celebrity who shunned publicity for his good deeds had planted a seed that would continue growing for years to come. Not all heroes wore capes indeed, some just quietly bought popcorn and changed lives forever.